محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. فقد نوينا التعلم وتعليم وتذكر وتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة نبيه والدعاء إلى الهدى والدلالة على خير وكل ما نواه مشايخنا ابتغاء وجه الله وثوابه وقربه. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما نافعا يا كريم. Alhamdulillah, in our Coffee and Connections sessions, we've been looking at the amazing and time-tested work of Imam Abdullah bin Alawi al-Haddad, who is known as Qutb al-Da'wa wal-Irshad, the pillar of calling to Allah and guiding. And we're discussing the opening of his book, the Book of Assistance. Now, just as a note of fa'idah, because we didn't go into this earlier, that the full name of the book is Risalatul Mu'awana wal Mudahara wal Mu'azara lirraghibina min al-mu'minina fi suluki tariq al-akhirah. Right, so it's a very long title. It's if we try to translate it, he says Risalatul Mu'awana, right, the treatise of assistance, wal Mudahara, and mutual aid, wal Mu'azara, and mutual support, for lirraghibin, for those who are yearning, min al-mu'minin, amongst the believers, fi suluki tariq al-akhirah, for the right, to travel, or yearning to travel the path of the hereafter. And so there's a lot of meanings just embedded in the title itself. Right? So there's an idea of mutual assistance, that we are supporting each other because we are believers. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةٌ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ كَالْبُنْيَانِ, that the believers are like one building, one edifice. Right? يَشُدُّ بَعْضُهُمْ بَعْضًا, that each of them supports the other. Right? So we are assisting each other. Now, this assistance is obviously happening, right? One side of the assistance is happening from Imam al-Haddad, right? So he is assisting us, right? And out of his humility, he is considering us as an assistant to him as well. And part of the etiquette of reading the books of these great Imams is to make dua for them. To make dua for them when you start the book, and to make dua for them when you finish the book. And then in the middle of the book, one thing that is commonly forgotten is that if the Imam makes a dua within the book, we are supposed to say Ameen. Okay, because we understand already that the Imam's intentions in writing this book were not just for his time, nor for his students specifically, nor for his students only, but for anyone who is ever to come across this book till the end of time. Right? So those du'as are just as relevant and valid for us, right, if we say Ameen to them, right, as they are for those of that time. Right? So then he says, right, so this is a mutual assistance happening for those who are yearning for the path of the akhirah. Right? Those amongst the believers who are yearning for the path of the akhirah. Now, there are believers who believe in the akhirah, but they're not yearning for it. Right? And so he is speaking, so this book is directly going to be even more beneficial for a specific type of believer. Right? The believer who is not satisfied with just the material gains of this life. The believer who is not satisfied with just performing the obligatory prayers and just doing the bare minimum of their religion and what is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from them. Right? There are some believers who want more than that. They want more than just the mediocre. They want more than just the bare minimum, and that could be for many reasons. It could be because of a khayr ilahiyya fi qulubihim, because of a good that Allah put in their hearts. it could be because they've already tasted something of of the comforts of being near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they're yearning for an increase or for that again, or they are تحت عناية, that they are people who are subsumed in the divine concern, or the concern of the people who have become Rabbani, right? The people who have become Lord-like or Lordly, right? The closest servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the elite of His servants, right? So Imam al-Haddad, he kind of alludes to this in his book, this Etiquettes of the Seeker, that the whole entire path starts by an impulse that is cast into the heart that drives a person, and actually yuz'ijuhu, it annoys them that they can't not follow that impulse. That for them not to seek more would bother them. That they're bothered toward the right path. Right? That everything else is not sufficient for them. This world has not enough for them. That they want more. They want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says that this impulse is the best blessing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can give to anyone, because those who want to seek Allah are those who Allah is seeking for them to come near Him. And he says that this impulse can occur for multiple reasons, and one of them is by the glance of one of the elite servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they glance at that person with the eye of mercy, with the eye of concern, with the eye of seeking divine guidance for that person, right? And because these people are not the same as other people, right? إنهم, right? ينظرون بنور الله, right? As the hadith goes, that these people, they see, that they look and they glance with the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So once that light is cast into the heart, they become amongst these people. That the راغبين من المؤمنين في سلوك طريق الآخرة, that they are yearning, they are believers who yearn to traverse, to travel the path that's leading toward the Akhirah. Right, so one of the most important things for the seeker and for the person who wishes to benefit from these great Imams is to dig deep and try to build and strengthen that irada, that desire to come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And right, for the sake of time, I would strongly encourage everyone to read the book, The Etiquettes of the Seeker, where he discusses this, and he discusses how to strengthen it, how to preserve it, and how to respond to that impulse. Tamam. So we have reached some of the important issues that Imam al-Haddad mentions in his introduction. Amongst the most important of them is the intentions that he had for writing this book, right? And we mentioned that they break down to two main things. One is the rewards and the merits that are promised in the Quran and the Hadith for the one who guides others to good, who teaches others good, who call people to guidance. Right? So he's writing this book as a means of attaining that reward. And then secondly, that there's the Hadith and the verses of the Quran which speak against the person who hides, who conceals their knowledge, who do not call toward the good, who do not forbid the evil, right? Those who have been given knowledge and do not partake in disseminating it, right? So the warnings that come to those people, so he wants to stay away from those. So those are his two main intentions. And we've reached where he says, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, he says, وَقَدْ صَدَّرْتُ فُصُولَ هَذِهِ الرِّسَالَةِ بِقَوْلِي فِي أَوْلِ كُلِّ فَصْلٍ مِنْهَا وَعَلَيْكَ. He says, I have put at the beginning of every chapter of this treatise my saying, وَعَلَيْكَ, and it is incumbent upon you. It is incumbent upon you. Right, so he's giving advice. It is incumbent upon you to do this. It is incumbent upon you to do this. So each chapter starts in that manner, right? but what was his intention in doing so? He says, بِكَذَا قَاصِدًا بِذَلِكَ مُخَاطِبَةِ النَّفْسِ. Right? And by doing so, I am intending, when I say وَعَلَيْكَ, it is incumbent upon you that I'm speaking to myself, first and foremost. وَأَخِي الَّذِي كَانَ سَبَبًا فِي وَضْعِهَا, and my brother, meaning his students, who was the one who asked him to write this treatise, خصوصا, specifically for him and himself, وَسَائِرِ مَنْ وَقَفَ عَلَيْهَا مِنَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ عُمُومًا, and every other believer who comes across this book. Right, so he's speaking to us, most definitely, but he's also mentioning that he's speaking to himself. Right? And this is from the amazing level of humility of the Imam. And we see this through all of his works. This is not just something he did in the Book of Assistance, rather this is how he carried himself. Right? He was the type that before the Fajr prayer, he would go around the entire city and fill up all the wudu areas with water. Obviously they didn't have the running water at that time. Right? He would fill up all the jabiyah, all the basins that they would use for wudu for everyone, and no one knew who did it for long periods of time. Right? So he was like that, and we see this in his poetry as well. Right? He has one poem, it's quite long actually, where the first verse goes, تَفِيضُ عُيُونِي بِالدُّمُوعِ السَّوَاكِبِ وَمَا لِي أَلَا أَبْكِي عَلَى خَيْرِ ذَاهِبِ. He says that my eyes are flowing with tears. Right? And why should I not cry? For the best thing that I have is fleeting, right? It's going away. And in that poem, he lists all the things that he's remorseful for. Every single thing that he's remorseful for. Right? And amongst them, right, he said, على فرص كانت لو أني انتهزتها نلت فيها من شريف المطالب. That there are so many opportunities that I had I taken advantage of them, I would have attained the most noble of aims, of goals. But right, we see that through his life, right, he's never left even a moment of a single opportunity to do any good deed. Right? So there's a big difference between how he is himself and how he sees himself. Right? Because amongst the qualities of perfection is that a person sees themselves, that they don't see themselves, they see the divine blessings and favor upon them. Right? And this is why it's said that witnessing that all your deeds are gifts and favors and blessings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, is better than you perceiving that your deeds are from yourself and that they're deficient. Right? So perceiving that your deeds are deficient is a good thing, but you're still acknowledging yourself in that. You're not fully absolving yourself of any merit and giving it all to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is full slavehood to Allah, ubudiyya. Right? So we see this inherent humility in the Imam, right? And because of that humility, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevated him. And because of that humility, hundreds of years later, right, we are reading his text. Right? This work has been translated into many languages. Right? As the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he said, I can swear on 3 things. One of them is مَنْ تَوَاضَعَ لِلَّهِ رَفَعَهُ اللَّهِ. Whoever lowers themselves, whoever humbles themselves for Allah, not for the people, not to be called humble, not for any other reason, but for Allah, Allah will elevate them. Right? So he continues, he says, وَهَذِهِ الْكَلِمَةُ لَهَا وَقْعٌ فِي قَلْبِ الْمُخَاطَبِ. Right? That this word, وَعَلَيْكَ, and it's incumbent upon you, this statement has a huge effect on the heart of the one being addressed. وَأَنْجُوا بِهَا إن شاء الله تعالى من التوبيخ والوعيد الواردين في حق من يقول ما لا ولا يفعل ويعلم ولا يعمل. And I hope, insha'Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that I am saved by means of this, by means of addressing myself, right, along with you, the reader, from the rebuke and the threats that are mentioned in the Quran and the Hadith, with regard to the person who tells people to do things but they don't do them himself, but doesn't do them oneself, or teaches others to do but they themselves do not do. Right? So he's adding himself in the admonishment so as not to be amongst those who tell others to do and they don't do themselves. He's telling himself to do as well. لأني إذا خاطبت نفسي بقولي وعليك دل ذلك على أنها لم تتحقق بالعمل بما علمت. Right? Because if I address myself by saying it is incumbent upon you, meaning myself, right, then that indicates to the fact that myself, right, that my own self has not realized the actions, full action on what it knows, right, full implementation of its knowledge. وعلى أني لم أزل أحثها على استعمال ما تدعو إليه, and that I am still striving to push myself to implement all that I am calling toward. Right? He's speaking in the third person, meaning he's speaking about himself, his lower self, the nafs. وبذلك يزول التلبيس على المؤمنين, and he says by means of that the delusion is removed from the believer. والنسيان للنفس الذي وصف الله تعالى به من لا يعقل. Right? And the idea of forgetting the self, forgetting one's own self, right, which Allah mentions in the Quran as an attribute of the person who has no intellect. Right? في قوله تعالى, in his statements, أتأمرون الناس بالبر وتنسون أنفسكم وأنتم تتلون الكتاب أفلا تعقلون. Allah says, do you command the people toward righteousness and then forget yourselves, right, while you are the ones who recite the book? Right? Do you not then have intellect? Do you not think? ومن الوعيد الوارد في حق من يقول ولا يفعل في قول رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Right? And I also hope to be saved from the threats that is mentioned with regards to the one who says that which they don't do, right, in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he says, يُؤْمَرُ بِالْعَالِمِ إِلَى النَّارِ فَتَنْدَلِقُ أَقْتَابُهُ, that on the day of judgment, the scholar, right, the learned person or the knowledgeable person will be commanded toward the fire, and their insides, their organs, right, will come out of their bodies, right, because of the fire. فَيَدُورُ بِهَا فِي النَّارِ كَمَا يَدُورُ الْحِمَارُ بِالرِّحَاءِ. Right? And they will go around their intestines in the fire just like a donkey goes around the mill. فَيَجْتَمِعُ عَلَيْهِ أَهْلُ النَّارِ. All the people of the hellfire will then gather, right, in the presence of this person. فَيُقُولُونَ مَا بَالُ الْأَبْعَدِ. Right? And they would say that what's wrong with this person? And they call him Ab'ad. And the word Ab'ad actually linguistically means the one who is furthest away, the one who is cast far away. Right, so what's up with Ab'ad? Right? قَدْ آذَانَ عَلَى مَا بِنَا. Right? He has harmed us, right, with regards to what we were doing. Right? Meaning it explains it. He says, فَيُقُولُ إِنَّ الْأَبْعَدِ كَانَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْخَيْرِ وَلَا يَأْتِهِ. So the person will respond, he says that Ab'ad used to call everyone to do good, but he didn't do it himself. وَيَنْهَى عَنِ الشَّرِّ. And he would prohibit others from evil, but he would do it himself. He would still do the evil himself. Right? And all of this is leading up to what's probably building up in some of our minds at this moment. Right? One of the major misunderstandings with regards to calling to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Well, which we won't spoil, right? We'll save for a moment. He says, then he brings the next hadith, وَقَالَ عَلَيْهِ الصَّلَاةُ وَالسَّلَامُ الْعَالِمُ الَّذِي يَعْلَمُ وَلَا يَعْمَلُ مِثْلُ الْفَتِيلَةِ تُضِيءُ لِلنَّاسِ وَتَحْرِقُ نَفْسَهَا. That the scholar who has knowledge but does not act on that knowledge is like the candle that shines bright for other people but burns itself. And then the third hadith, he says, وَقَالَ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامُ, and the Prophet ﷺ said, مَرَرْتُ لَيْلَةَ أُسْرِيَ بِي بِرِجَالٍ تُقْرَضُ شِفَاهُهُمْ بِمَقَارِيضَ مِنْ نَارٍ. I had passed by on the day of the Isra, of the night journey, by people whose mouths will be cut, ripped open with claws of fire. فَقُلْتُ مَنْ أَنْتُمْ. So I said, who are you guys? Right? Who are you? فَقَالُوا كُنَّا نَأْمُرُ بِالْخَيْرِ وَلَا نَأْتِيهِ وَنَنْهَى عَنِ الشَّرِّ وَنَأْتِيهِ. So they responded and said that we were those who commanded toward the good, but did not do it ourselves, and we prohibited from the evil, but we used to do it. Right, so that's why they were being punished in the hellfire on that day, on the day of judgment, or in the hereafter. وَهَذَا الْوَعِيدُ إِنَّمَا يَتَحَقَّقُ فِي حَقِّ مَنْ يَدْعُو إِلَى اللَّهِ عَلَى نِيَّةِ الدُّنْيَا. Now this is an important misconception, because we have verses of the Quran and we have hadith about the person who has knowledge, doesn't implement it, right? They tell others to act on it, but they don't act on it themselves. Right? So, right, first, one question may come is, why then should I even learn? Right? Because if I learn, I'm just putting myself in jeopardy to fall under these threats, right, and these warnings. Right? The second issue is that, what about does that mean that every single scholar out there has to be 100% perfect in everything they do? Right? In order otherwise they are damned on the day of judgment. Right? So he says that وَهَذَا الْوَعِيدُ, that these threats that we've just mentioned and these warnings are only realized with regards to the one who calls to Allah with the intention of worldly things, with a worldly intention. They're calling to Allah for the sake of money. They're calling to Allah for the sake of status. Right? They're calling to Allah for worldly gains, not for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. وَيَحُثُّ عَلَى الْخَيْرِ وَهُوَ مُصِرٌّ عَلَى تَرْكِهِ. Right? And right? Likewise, those who encourage others to do good, but they are persistently abandoning it. وَيُحَذِّرُ مِنَ الشَّرِّ وَهُوَ مُصِرٌّ عَلَى فِعْلِهِ. And they are warning people from the evil, but they are persistent in doing it. رِيَاءً وَسُمْعَةً. Right? Showing off, right, for the sake of name and fame, if you want to, a translation, right, for the sake of name and fame, for the sake of status. Right, so they're not doing it they're not doing it for the religious purposes that it demands. They're not doing it for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. Right? And they're specifically not doing it intending themselves in those addresses. Right? So he says, فَأَمَّا مَنْ يَدْعُو إِلَى بَابِ اللَّهِ وَهُوَ مَعَ ذَلِكَ يُلُومُ نَفْسَهُ وَيَنْهَاهَا عَنِ التَّقْصِيرِ وَيَحُثُّهَا عَلَى التَّشْمِيرِ فَالنَّجَاةُ مَرْجُوَّةٌ لَهُ. He says, as for the one who calls to the door of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala while blaming themselves for not fully implementing everything and prohibiting themselves, right, from completely neglecting everything, and encouraging and trying to encourage themselves to do better and better, right, then salvation is hoped for these people. These are not the people who those verses apply to. Right? Those verses apply to those who only command for the sake of, right, for the sake of worldly gains. Right? And we can see this in the verse of Quran that we mentioned, or that the Imam brought. It says, أَتَأْمُرُونَ النَّاسَ بِالْبِرِّ, that do you command people toward righteousness, when تَنْسَوْنَ أَنفُسَكُمْ, and forget yourselves. And forget yourselves is an important part. Right? Because the one who's commanding others to good, and along with that they realize that they are not fully living up to that good, and they are remorseful for that, and they admit to their deficiencies to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they are not forgetting themselves. They are not forgetting themselves. Right? The one who is doing it for worldly gains, and then they're forgetting their own accountability on the day of judgment. So he says, right, that's one answer. Right? But there's another answer as well, right, which he mentions in just 2 lines. Alhamdulillah. Right, so he says, رحمه رضي الله عنه, وعلى كل حال. Right, and in any case, فالذي يعلم ويعلم ولا يعمل أحسن حالا وأرشد طريقة وأحمد عاقبة من الذي لا يعمل ولا يعلم. Right, the one who knows, I mean the one who has knowledge of the religion, right, and teaches others, right, but does not implement that knowledge themselves, right, is in a more beautiful state, in a more guided path, and a more praiseworthy outcome than the one who does not act and does not have knowledge. Now let's break that down for a second before we continue. Essentially, there are three things that are mandated to us as believers, and they're necessary things for the path. For anyone who's truly seeking, you can't seek without these three things. Right? That part of the seeking is these three things. The first and most important, or not necessarily the most important, but first and integral part and fundamental part of the path, right, is to learn, to have knowledge of what Allah, of the proper way to fulfill the duties that you owe to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? How the knowledge of how to obey Allah the way He wants us to obey Him. Right? That's first. That's knowledge. Right? The second is acting on that knowledge. Right? Both of these is the path. That is the path. We know and we apply. Right? As the saying goes, إِنَّمَا الْعِلْمُ لِلْعَمَلِ بِهِ. The only reason why their knowledge is there is to act upon it. وَإِن لَمْ يَكُونِ الْعُلَمَاءُ الْعَامِلِينَ مِنْ أَوْلِيَاءِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى فَلَيْسَ لِلَّهِ وَلِيٌّ. That if those who know and act upon their knowledge are not amongst the elite saints of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then Allah does not have saints. Right? That is the deen. And all of these awliya that we're talking about are ulama amilin. They had knowledge and they implemented it. Right? But the third requirement of this ummah specifically is to teach people, to call people toward guidance. And we've already mentioned many of the hadith related to that. Right? To teach those to teach what one knows. And it doesn't mean that you have to become a great scholar in order to teach anything. No. Right? Once you learn something in an authentic way, and it is correct and it's understood correct, and you took it from a person who took it from a person back to the Prophet ﷺ, right, and it's understood and authentically, you are a scholar of that one thing. Right? So if you learned how to do your wudu from a proper scholar, and they saw you do it, and they know that your understanding is correct, you can teach anyone the wudu. Right? So you're a scholar of the wudu. Right, so part of the tradition is that we teach others, we call others toward this good. So if we see each of them as an individual obligation of this beautiful deed, right, then the one who has knowledge, right, and calls people to it but does not act on it has 2 out of the 3 obligations. Right? Whereas the one who says, you know what, I'm not going to learn, because if I learn, then I have to act on it. And if I learn, I have to teach it. Right? So they don't learn, they don't act, and they don't teach. They have 0 out of the 3. Right? And that is a big misconception. Right? That I'm not going to attend any classes. Why not? Right? Because if I learn something, then I have to act on it, or else I'm a hypocrite. Right? If you don't go to the class, and it's knowledge that you require, and you don't learn it, you are sinful for not doing the action and not knowing for the action, regardless of whether you know or not. Right? It is obligatory to seek the knowledge. Tamam. Right? So the person who knows and teaches but doesn't act is better than the one who doesn't act, nor do they have the knowledge. Right? Because one has 2 out of the 3, the other one has 0 out of 3. So that's the first ishkal, the first misunderstanding that he clears up for us. The second, he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, رُبَّمَا قَالَ قَائِلٌ مِّن مَّن لَا يَعْقِلُ. Right? It's possible that someone who doesn't fully understand says, right, the following question. Right? So here's the objection. الكتب كثيرة. Right? There are many books out there. وفيها غنية وكفاية فلا فائدة في تصنيف الكتب في هذا الزمان. Right? There's so many books out there, and that's right, that suffices everyone. Right? So there's no need to write any more books in this time. Okay? That's the question. So he says, فهذا القائل إن أصاب في قوله إن في الكتب غنية وكفاية فقد أخطأ في قوله لا فائدة في التصنيف في هذا الزمان. Right, so he says, the questioner, even though they are right when they said that there are many books and those books are sufficient, right, they have erred in the second part of their statement, that there is no benefit in authoring new books in this time. Why, he says, and he gives the reason, Imam al-Haddad gives the reason, he says, لِأَنَّ لِلْقُلُوبِ مَيْلًا بِحُكْمِ الْجِبِلَّةِ إِلَى كُلِّ جَدِيدٍ. He says, because the hearts naturally, by temperament, are inclined toward everything that is new. وَأَيْضًا فَإِنَّ اللَّهِ يُنْطِقُ عُلَمَاءَ كُلِّ زَمَانٍ بِمَا يُوَافِقُ أَهْلَهِ. And likewise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspires the scholars of each time period to speak, right, to say that which is specifically required for their people. وَالتَّصَانِيفُ تَبْلُغُ الْأَمَاكِنَ الْبَعِيدَةِ. And if there's many different works of a specific subject, for instance, then they will reach further places. Right? One book may not reach all the places, the other books may. Right? وَتَبْقَى بَعْدَ مَوْتِ الْعَالِمِ فَيَحْصُلُ لَهُ بِذَلِكَ فَضْلُ نَشْرِ الْعِلْمِ. Right? And these works will last even after the death of the scholar who wrote them. Right? So they will continuously attain the reward of spreading knowledge, even in their grave. And this is from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that إِذَا مَاتَ ابْنَ آدَمَ انْقَطَعَ عَمَلُهُ إِلَّا مِنْ ثَلَاثٍ. That when the child of Adam passes away, all of their deeds cease except for three. Right? Continuous charity or knowledge that is benefited from. Right? So how does a deceased person leave behind knowledge? Right? In two things, in their students and in their books. In their students and in their books. And they continue to receive the rewards of that, of anyone who acts upon those works, or anyone who takes from those students and then teaches themselves, all the way till the Day of Judgment, even though they are in their graves. وَيَكْتُبُ مُعَلِّمًا دَاعِيًا إِلَى اللَّهِ تَعَالَى فِي قَبْرِهِ. Right? And that person will be decreed as a teacher and a caller to Allah, even if they are in their grave. Right? So, say for instance, we discovered a whole trunk of books from a scholar that passed away 500 years ago. Right? No one knew those works were there. The author himself buried the books. Right? So from the time that we start reading from those books and benefiting from books, that the reward is going to that person, even though they've been in their graves for 500 years. And this actually happened at the time of Imam al-Haddad. It wasn't 500 years, but his books were buried at the time of the communist overtake of South Yemen, right? And they were later discovered and taken to Egypt to be printed, right? And now we are benefiting from them, right? So he says, كما قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من أنعش لسانه حقا يعمل به من بعده أجري عليه أجره إلى يوم القيامة. Right? He said, whoever lets their tongue speak the truth, and those after them follow that truth, and they implement that truth, then their reward is continuously given to them all the way till the Day of Judgment. Right, so we see a response to a few different issues here. That one, right, knowledge, seeking knowledge, implementing the knowledge, and calling people toward that knowledge are all individual obligations. Right? Just because one does not see themselves as fully implementing what they know does not mean that they shouldn't call. Right? And because a person does not act on their knowledge, doesn't mean that they shouldn't seek the knowledge. Right? So, for instance, if a person doesn't act on their knowledge, doesn't mean that they shouldn't seek the knowledge. Right? And because a person doesn't act on their knowledge, doesn't mean that they shouldn't seek the knowledge. Right? rather, if a person is teaching or calling to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or in the right, or an imam of a masjid, or even an influential person of their community, then they should first and foremost, whenever they speak, they should speak and keep with the intention of addressing themselves. One, right? They should speak with the full recognition and acknowledgement of their own deficiencies and their remorse, and they should be remorseful for not fulfilling the rights of that knowledge, right? And they should strive to improve, right? So it's not a defeatist, oh, I'm terrible, right, so let me not improve. No, right? I have deficiencies, so let me work on them. Let me strive to implement everything that I know. Now for the talibul ilm, the seeker of knowledge, the person who's still in the marhala, in the stage of study, right? It is best for them, right? Well, really, it's the only way, right? The ideal for them is that as they learn, they implement, right? So they're going to be learning gradually. So if they implement gradually, right, they could eventually reach the point where, as they grow in their knowledge, they also grow in their worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's how it's supposed to be. That is how it's supposed to be. Right? And that is the path of wilayah. That is the path of sainthood and electhood with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Al-ilmu wal-amalu wal-khashya wal-wara' wal-khawf min Allah. Right? Knowledge, implementation of the knowledge, reverence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, scrupulousness, and fear of Allah. That's the path, as Habib Ali al-Habashi, right, mentioned. Now he tells us why he mentioned what he named the book, and he just mentions a few more lines before he starts the opening chapter. He says, وَقَدْ سَمَّيْتُ هَذِهِ الرِّسَالَةَ الْمُشَارَ إِلَيْهَا and I have named this treatise رسالة المعاونة والمظاهرة والمؤازرة للراغبين من المؤمنين في سلوك طريق الآخرة. The treatise, or the book of mutual assistance, you could say mutual victory also. Zahara means to assist someone in giving victory. Right? It's pretty much the same word as I got your back, because it comes from the word zahar. Right? Mudahara, mu'azara, right, is to mutual strengthening, right, to assist someone with, right, for those amongst the believers who are yearning to travel the path of the akhirah. And then he makes a dua, and I remind myself and everyone that whenever these great imams make dua, we should always say Ameen. He says, أسأل الله تعالى أن ينفعني بها وسائر المؤمنين. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to benefit me by means of this treatise, as well as all of the believers. وأن يجعل جمعي لها واعتنائي بها وبتأليفها خالصا لوجهه الكريم. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make my compilation of it, and my concern in it, and my authoring of it completely and sincerely 100% for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's noble countenance. Ameen, ameen. وَهَذَا أَوَانُ الْإِبْتِدَاءِ. Now is the time to begin. وَبِاللَّهِ تَوْفِيقٍ. And all success is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَأَقُولُ. So I say, مُسْتَعِينًا بِاللَّهِ تَعَالَى, seeking aid from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَمُفَوِّضًا إِلَيْهِ, and consigning the matter to Him, وَسَائِلًا مِنْهُ, and asking of Him, أَن يُوَفِّقَنِي لِإِصَابَةِ الصَّوَابِ, to grant me success in reaching the truth, فِي النِّيَّاتِ وَالْأَعْمَالِ وَالْأَقْوَالِ, in all my intentions, in all actions, in all statements. فَإِنَّهُ وَلِيُّ ذَلِكَ, for He is able to do so, and He is He's the guardian of that, وَالْقَادِرُ عَلَيْهِ, and able to do so, وَهُوَ حَسْبِي وَنِعْمَ الْوَكِيلِ, and He is sufficient for me and the best of guardians. Ameen. Right, so alhamdulillah, we have finished the introduction of the work. right? And we see some very great meanings in this introduction, right, toward why he wrote it, right? What is his intention in the way that he wrote it, right? So وَعَلَيْكَ, right, he's speaking to himself and to all the believers, right? And in this dua he says here that وَبِاللَّهِ tawfiq, and with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all success, right? I just want, since we're closing here and next week we will start from the first chapter, the chapter of certainty, I want all of us to remind ourselves and to remember and to never forget that our ability to do any good deed, especially a good deed such as great as being able to read the works of those who Allah loves, it only occurs out of the divine favor, because of Allah's mercy upon us, because of Allah's favor upon us, right? Not because we deserve it, not for any specific quality of our own selves, right? But rather only for the sake, right? Only because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is generous to us, right? And the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed us to start upon this book, right, is a great sign that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right, is going to further give us more tawfiq, which is more divine facilitation, to not only implement it, right, to call others to it, and inshallah to one day finish the work. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with all, right, to allow us to realize on us all of the intentions of the author in writing this work, and to allow us to be under the divine concern that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to the Imam al-Haddad, to also give it to us, and the ennoblements that Allah has given to Imam al-Haddad, to also bless us with that. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to raise the ranks of Imam al-Haddad, to increase his good deeds, and to return upon us all of the blessing, the knowledge, and the light, and the good of this Imam upon us. Wa sallallahu ta'ala ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Al-Fatiha. Ameen. Just as a last note, next week inshallah we'll start on the book of sincerity, the book of certainty, and just as a reminder that the way that this book is supposed to be studied is that each chapter that comes, we implement it right away, and we don't move on to the next chapter until we have fully implemented the first. And since this class is a weekly class, then every chapter that we go through, we want to put it upon ourselves, make it our own take-home assignments, right, to work on ourselves, right, to try our best to implement for that week that chapter. Right, so we ask Allah to allow us to be able to do that and to benefit in the best ways. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Jazakumullahu khair. If there's any questions we can take, inshallah the further classes will be more of a discussion based, but the introduction kind of doesn't lend itself to that style.
Should the common Muslim intend to become a scholar, even if they are gathering knowledge slowly and not formally a student of knowledge?
Now, right, the common Muslim, or any Muslim, should intend to learn. Right? Gaining titles is not really what is sought. Right? Gaining the title of being a scholar, right, is not really what is sought. Right? Essentially, it's not the obligation in the matter. And today, terms and these kind of terms are thrown around too loosely anyway. Right? So it's not about spending a certain amount of years in a certain place and then you get a paper. Right? That does not make a scholar right? Specifically. Right? That is a path, that is one way toward scholarship, but the most important thing is that one prioritizes the knowledge that is obligatory on them, right? And to seek it consistently, even if it takes a long time, that is not a problem. Right? Because the knowledge is for Allah. It's not for a title or for a name or for a position. Right? It's for Allah. And the more that you learn of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from you, the easier the path becomes. And many people think it's the opposite, that the more you learn, the more restrictions you have. No, it's actually amazingly the opposite. It's quite facilitating, right? And it removes all confusion, right? And thirdly, right, the shaitan has very little impact on the person who has knowledge and a deep understanding of the deen. Right? As the hadith goes, al-faqih al-wahid wa shaddu ala shaytani min alfi abid. One person of deep understanding is better than is harder on the shaitan than 1,000 mere worshippers. I mean, a person who does the actions but they don't have deep understanding. Right? So, but there is great khair, there is great good in freeing yourself up for the sake of knowledge. Freeing yourself up for the sake of knowledge and taking the path of knowledge very seriously. If you want to call that the path toward being a scholar, then okay, but again, don't get caught up in terms and titles. Hope that helps. Any other questions? The Prophet ﷺ said, "Man kharaja fi talab al-ilmi fahuwa fi sabilillahi hatta yarji'." Whoever goes out in search of knowledge, right, then they are in the path of Allah until they return. Right? So, freeing yourself up for knowledge is the way of the righteous, a way of many of the great scholars of the past. If one has that luxury, if not, then one consistently devotes a certain amount of time, daily, weekly, to seeking knowledge, and aiming to seek it from the most credible sources at one's disposal.
Is one sinful for spreading knowledge without being consistent in implementing what we learn?
Is one sinful for spreading knowledge without being consistent in implementing what we learned? Not necessarily. Right? So not acting on a knowledge is a fault in and of itself, whether it relates to calling to another person or not. Right? Right? So the person who knows and calls but doesn't fully implement has 2 out of the 3 obligations. They are better than the one who knows, doesn't act, and doesn't call, who only has 1 out of the 3. Right? And in actuality, one of the great Indian scholars, Maulana Ashraf Ali Tanwi, he used to say that if I ever wanted to bring a certain quality into my life, right, in this case implementation of the knowledge, right, then I call other people toward it, because calling people to it has a great effect in bringing life to the heart and encouraging oneself to do it. Right, so it actually may be the desirable thing that if you have knowledge and you feel that you're falling short in your implementation, that you call people toward it, because that will stir up within you the desire and the ambition and determination needed in order to implement that knowledge. Right? And it may be such that a person learns, right, and right, they're learning faster than their progress of implementing goes. Right, so that's not necessarily a bad thing. Right? People may need time to be able to implement everything properly. Right? And that's why prioritizing your implementation must be first by leaving all of the haram and fulfilling all of the obligations. Right? And that's not a lot. That's not a lot. Right? So the 5-time prayers, right? The fasting Ramadan, those are obligations, being good to your parents, right? And so forth. And removing all of the haram, right? So not looking at the haram, not lying, not backbiting, not eating the haram, not having haram wealth, right? Not being bad to your parents, not stealing, not killing, right? Not lying, right? That's the first start. After that, then it's nura ala nur, it's light upon light, right? That's the bare minimum. Right? Then you implement the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, you leave that which is disliked, and then you go to more, right? And the path, right, of removing from our lives everything that distracts us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is near the end of the path. So,
Can a beginner still teach their family what they know?
yes, right? Can a beginner teach their family what they know? Yes, right? But a person who's beginning in their seeking of knowledge, they should only teach in accordance to what they know, after having verified that they know it properly, right? So, and that's why it's best to take one's knowledge from a teacher, because the teacher will be able to correct one's misunderstandings, as opposed to taking it directly from books. And you have a great blessing here at Seeker's Guidance. You have hundreds and hundreds of hours of courses, right, online with authentic teachers, and there's course forums that you can ask questions. So if you don't feel like you really understand, you can ask questions. Right, so take those opportunities. But as a person does learn something and they do know it correctly, they can more than welcome to teach it. Rather, they're encouraged to teach it. Do you have to have a witness when you say your shahada? I took my shahada in my father's office in my house, just me and my brother. No one was there. It is generally recommended to do so, because it makes the initiation of that person into Islam more formal. Therefore, it gives it more importance and more reverence, right? Right? But it is not a requirement. A person is still Muslim. Right? Even if a person, like for instance my brother, he became Muslim, he said his own shahada to himself. Right? Right? Later on he did it in the masjid, right? But that is valid. If you believe in the tenets of the faith and you say Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa anna Muhammadur Rasulullah, right? Then you are a believer. Right? You are considered a believer. Right, but even just merely believing it is enough, right? But but we can't consider someone a believer unless they profess it to us. Right, so the witness is not an obligation, but can be recommended in certain circumstances. How do you know if you've implemented the knowledge, especially if it's theoretical or spiritual? Is that it? Theoretical, mental, or spiritual. Okay, that's a good point, because there is knowledge of the Sharia, which is knowledge of fiqh. Right? And the knowledge of fiqh are the law, the sacred law that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. And the sacred law generally applies to our limbs, right? To how we act in the world, to actions, right? So, and because they have to do with the outward aspects, right? With the actions themselves, it's easier to implement those first, right? So a person does the prayer properly, right? They do the fasting, right? They do the zakat, they do the hajj, they do all these things outwardly, properly, the wudu, the ghusl. Right? That one should prioritize that first in their implementation. However, the inward sciences, like the science of spirituality, right, the removal of arrogance, the removal of jealousy and pride and ostentation and all of these qualities of the heart, right, that is something that many of the scholars would encourage that you seek someone who can help you down that path. Right? Because there are some ailments that you may know that you have, but there are others that are very subtle that you may not know. Right? So the path of implementation of that, right, aside from the theoretical parts of spirituality, because you're learning about arrogance, learning the signs of arrogance, that's theory. Right? How do you put that into implementation? How do you act on that? Right? Imam al-Ghazali says that first you have to find what faults that you have to diagnose, right, and then you can treat, right? So by reading the symptoms or the signs of arrogance, you may be able to diagnose that you have arrogance, right? And then you can implement the cure. But for the more subtle ones, right, Imam Ghazali, he mentions that there's three or four ways to find out your own faults. One is to have a good friend that will watch you as you interact in the world and watch you what you do, and then point out to you that you have certain faults. So if they see that you're quick to anger, that you're a bit arrogant, you're a bit harsh sometimes, they'll tell you, and then you work on those things. Or you can listen to the criticisms of those who don't like you, right? Because not all the time are they lying, right? Not just because you don't like them doesn't mean that they're lying. But one of them, he says, to have Shaykh basirin, that to have a spiritual mentor who is well versed in this science, and they can see, they have insight toward the inward blameworthy qualities of the pupils, right? So there are people who can, right, because Allah blessed them with the ability, they can see these blameworthy qualities in the hearts of their students, and they can guide them how to fix it, right? But that's a life journey. Right? And as a person is in the progress, and they're at the same time they are recognizant of their deficiencies, then they are in increase. They are increase, and they have to learn how to seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and humble themselves before Allah, and ask Allah to remove those qualities for them while they strive as best as they can outwardly. Right? But it starts with the outward implementation, and then one can work their way in. And generally, implementing the outward will have a very curative effect on many of the qualities that are in the heart. Right? And then on top of that, you have, right, certain things that facilitate the purification of the heart, like constant remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, constant awrad, right, spiritual routines, the morning and evening du'as, the du'as of the righteous, voluntary prayers, like for instance the tahajjud prayer, reciting the Quran, reflection, and these things. But person takes, right, step by step, slowly, and they trying to work on one thing at a time is the best way. One more?
The person is asking, like, the absence of sinful for knowledge without implementation.
Okay.
They're asking, how do we understand the following hadith on the night of my entrance of heaven, attacked by people whose lips were being cut by pincers from the hellfire? So I asked, who are you? They replied, we used to order people to do good and not do it ourselves, and advise people against evil, even as we were doing it ourselves.
Yeah, so Imam Haddad, he specifically mentioned that those hadith are in relation to the one who calls people to do good merely for worldly intentions. Merely for worldly intentions. Right? So either they did it for money, so they were paid to teach, right? But or they did it for status, right? They did it to be called the Shaykh or the alim or the scholar or for these titles, or to be given preference in gatherings. Right? So the people who teach the deen and call people toward the deen for worldly reasons, right? Those hadith are most befitting for those people. Right? Likewise, right? But as for the person who calls people toward the deen, but they themselves are not living up to what they say, but they know that, and they recognize that, and they are remorseful for that, and they're trying their best to do better, right? Then those hadith do not apply to that person specifically. Those hadith do not apply to that person specifically. Because one of the reasons is that Allah will bring the qari, which is another word for scholar, on the Day of Judgment, and Allah will ask them that why did you learn or seek the knowledge? And they would say that I did it for you. right? And Allah will say that you lied. You did it for the people, right? And then they will be sent to the hellfire. And those are amongst the first three people, right? So we can see that obviously their intentions were not for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And we ask Allah to save us from having bad intentions. Allahumma inna na'udhu bika and nushrika bika shay'an na'lamu wa nastaghfiruka lima la na'lam. Oh Allah, we seek refuge in you from associating with you anything knowingly, and we ask forgiveness from you what we do unknowingly, right? And so a person, right, the teacher should always critique their intentions, should always be taking what they say and applying it to themselves and holding themselves to that standard, right, as much as they do to the other people, right? And a great example of that is Imam al-Haddad addressing himself when he's teaching, right? So those people don't fall under those hadith, even though they still have work to do.
How would one deal with family who disown you for being Muslim?
For being what? For being Muslim? How do you deal with family that disown you for being Muslim? When it comes to family, the relationship between the family is very fragile, and Islam commands us to make silatul rahim, right? To strive to join the family ties, right? To keep the connections tight, regardless of what they do in response. Right? And the question is, about being disowned for being Muslim is not something new. This is something that was actually common amongst the Sahaba, that they would become Muslim and then their family would cast them out. Right? We have the likes of Mus'ab bin Umair. We have, right, many examples. Right? The one companion, his mother said, "I'm not going to eat or drink anything until you leave Islam," and she almost killed herself. Right? And the companion, he said that even if you had 1,000 souls, and each one of that you would kill yourself 1,000 times, I would never leave Islam. And then she eventually got the point, and she started eating again. Right? So there's a balance between two things. One, we hold on to our principles, that we don't, right? لا طاعة لمخلوق في معصية الخالق, the Prophet said. Right? We don't, right? There's no obedience for the creation in the disobedience of the Creator. Right? Your being Muslim is what you're supposed to do with your Creator. Right? So that's one thing, that's our principles. But the second thing is how we tactfully, right, hold on to our principles while being respectful, right, to our family members. Right? So if they completely disown you, right, and kick you out of the house, right, then trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah will take care of you. Right? Right? Trust that Allah will take care of you, and take the means that you can to support yourself. Right? And then still in that point, even you may be upset, you might be resentful, right? But still Islam is calling us to be good to our parents. Right? It's not dependent on reciprocity, right? It's not, right, if my parents are good to me, then I'll be good to them. No. Regardless of whether they're good to you or not, you be good to them. So you go on your own, and you still try to keep ties. Send them a message, send them a card, send your mother some flowers, right? And eventually Allah is the one who can turn the hearts. Right? If you're staying in their home and they just disapprove of your Islam, right, then you can, right, out of tact, you can do your worships privately in your room and not kind of do it in their faces because it bothers them. When it comes to food, right, then just be tactful and, right, eat with them whatever is not, right, haram meat, right, and then, right, if you there's many situations where right, people would have their own food in their room or the likes, right? So you can consider your room your house. I mean, people have, like, dogs and things like that. Your room is your house. Just don't let the dog in the room, right? So, and if there's any, like, specifics that you're mentioning, then you can consult privately about that, right? But there's two things. We hold on to our principles because we live for Allah. That is the purpose of our life. He created us, no one else. Right? And we are going to return to Him and no one else. Right? But at the same time, we're tactful and respectful even when we decline. We respectfully decline. We do good to others in response to the bad that they do to us. And to close, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, لَيْسَ الْبَاصِرُ بِالْمُكَافِئِ, إِنَّمَا الْبَاصِرُ الَّذِي إِذَا قَطَعَ رَحِمَهُ وَصَلَهَا. The Prophet said that the one who joins family ties is not the one who does it with reciprocity, that only one the other side joins to, right? But the one who truly joins the ties, the family ties, is the one that when everyone else cuts them off, they join the ties, that they strive to mend. And one of the companions said to the Prophet that I strive to mend the relations of my family, and they just can keep cutting it off. Right? They keep cutting the ties. And the Prophet said, continue doing what you're doing. Right? And it is as if you're feeding them burning coals. Right? And understand what that means, meaning that you're doing good, right? And the fact that they're responding to your good with more evil, right, is bad for them. Right? But you're not responsible for the people's. Right? And you can win over people's hearts with beauty much better than you can with, right, cutting them off. Hope that helps. Always turn to Allah in your needs. Right? Allah is with you. So we'll stop there, inshallah. We'll start the next class right away. The Mukhtasar al-Quduri class right away. Wa sallallahu ta'ala ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Apologies for going over.